So I've been asked to speak about the political economy of financial sector reforms. And until I started applying my mind to it, I didn't quite realize what I had um, volunteered to do. Because it is actually extremely complex the more I thought about it. So what I tried to do was, some weeks ago, I had delivered a lecture at the O.P. Jindal Institute for Public Policy on a much broader set of issues, which relates to political economy. And there, the grandiose title of that lecture, hi, was the Guptas, the state, and the private sector. But that was only to make it catchy and for people to raise an eyebrow and say, oh, what is this? But really, what it was meant to convey is it should really have been called society, state, and markets. And it's really the interplay between society, government in its various forms, the state in its various forms rather, and markets that was of interest to me. So some of the things that I learned while preparing for that lecture, I have applied to this discussion on political economy of financial sector reform. So I'll start with the generic framework, and then I'll drill down to what I believe it implies for the financial sector and its reforms. So when it comes to, so I'll deal with my comments in two buckets before pulling the threads together. So Susan, how much time do I have now?
How much? I think we had budgeted for around 20 to
30 minutes, okay. 30 minutes should be fine. Because I can be sort of spuriously expansive, so I shall. Right. No, don't worry. Please don't worry about that. Right. So into two buckets. The first is really the interplay between the state and markets. And then I'll make a few comments about the interplay between state and society in the context of financial services, right, and the financial sector. So, state and markets. So, if you think about it, in many ways, India is a premature democracy. And what I mean by that is that we, as a country, got universal suffrage at a very early stage in our economic evolution. So if you compare us, our GDP per capita, when we got universal suffrage in 1951, with virtually any other democracy, mature democracy in the world, it's the comparison is really quite stark, and the political science literature is replete with examples of this. And for the case of India in particular, we got universal suffrage even before the United States did. The United States got universal suffrage only after the civil rights movement in 1964. And universal suffrage in the United Kingdom came with after the suffragette movement in 1921, I'd like to say, but I don't remember exactly. France likewise, and so on and so forth. So it was it's really a 20th century phenomenon that even the so-called mature democracies got universal suffrage. We got pretty much day one, very shortly after independence. So what does that mean? What is the implication of that? The implication of that, and it's in that regard that I argue that it's premature, is that the logic of any democratic system of governance is voice. You have to give access. You have to give equality of voice. That's what universal suffrage means, one person, one vote. And when you do that, there is a natural and inevitable political push towards different kinds of egalitarianism. So whether, and that depends on the cultural makeup of the society itself, but even in the United States, it's only after, or as they built up greater representation in their democracy, truly representative, that's when pressure on social spending actually began to grow, and you had the New Deal and so on and so forth. You can actually plot this, and you can see that for each of the large democracies, from the point at which they got universal suffrage, you can see exponential growth in social spending in each of those countries. So in that sense, in retrospect, I suppose I could even argue that having received democracy or won democracy the way, or created it, I mean, it was our own creation, the way we did, the fact that Nehru and his cohort at that time chose Fabian socialism, or a mixed market, mixed economy, was actually politically inevitable. He could not have chosen anything else, because that was the logic of the electoral system. He has to be representative, and he's representing a predominantly, an overwhelmingly poor nation. And therefore, to say that, ab initio, we could have been a freewheeling market economy was just politically out of the question. And to put it in numbers, the implication for India is that today, for example, in PPP terms, our GDP per capita is what it was in the US in 1880. But our social spending as a share of GDP is what it was in the US in the 1960s. So fiscal pressure to spend on equalizing the pie is just inevitable. It doesn't matter if it's the BJP today or the Swaraj party then or the Congress party, whenever. The political logic of the system is such that it has to push you in this direction. Okay, so that's the first point about our political economy. Because we are a democracy, representative democracy, there's this push towards egalitarianism. Second point about any democracy, and that's the rough and tumble of any democracy, is that it is a way of not adjudicating, but of giving expression to competing vested interests. And it's a very messy business. It depends on who's more influential, and there's only one impulse of influence that comes through electoral politics, but then there are lobbies, there are trade unions, there are corporate lobbies, and all of that. So, in the US, this translates into the largest corporate lobbying machine anywhere in the world. I don't remember the dollars that are spent on it, but it's humongous. But that's part of the rough and tumble of what democratic politics is all about. And we are no exception. So there is a very sort of natural and widespread perception that in our country our politicians are venal. And all the blame for our ills as a country is to be laid at the door of the venal politician, right? And it is factually correct that a disturbingly large number of our elected members of parliament have a criminal record. But let's leave that aside for a minute. For that reason and other reasons, the general impression is that our political class has let the country down very badly, and a lot of our ills are as a result of that. And I'd like to suggest to you that that is a very unfair, actually, diagnostic of the situation. Politicians will be politicians. Their job is to represent the vested interests that have put them in power. And actually, they have not done too bad a job of representing those interests in policy making, right? Um, and like in any system, there's a complex system of decision making. I forget who said that anything that goes into Congress, it's like a sausage machine. Congress in the United States is like a sausage machine. You know, all kinds of unimaginable ingredients go into making the sausage, but at the end of the day, some kind of sausage comes out. And the expectation is that it's reasonably edible, right? So if you look at it from that lens, what India has delivered in the 70 odd years since independence is actually it's a vegetarian sausage, so we'll be politically correct. It certainly doesn't have any beef in it, but the sausage that comes out has delivered results. And what are those results? Those results are that if you look at the composition of the Lok Sabha, for example, about 40% of the Lok Sabha is now scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and OBCs. It's still less than their representation in the census, but it's much larger than it has been any point in history. And so for a society such as ours, that from the perspective of the Dalits, for example, has been for so long so repressive, the fact that you have active participation in politics of this community and manifested in the form of numbers of MPs that sit in the Lok Sabha is not a mean achievement. Is the sort of modest point I wanted to make. Surely there is a huge way to go in terms of improving the quality of our political discourse and so on and so forth. But I'm just saying I'm calling for some fairness in diagnosing, who's the cause of our current travails, right? Now, what does this mean? So this has, unfortunately, the political logic of the democratic system at its point of evolution that we have created is such that it has massive implications for the quality of economic governance. So the case I've made is that in terms of just political governance, you might call it, it is incontestably true that India is significantly more representative than it has ever been in its history. And that's a achievement that we should actually be very proud of, right? The flip side of it is that the cost of this representation, which is a moral absolute, so I don't want to do a cost-benefit analysis and what people very simplistically call this is the cost of democracy. This is the nuance to it, right? The consequence, or one of the consequences of that great degree, robust degree, and improving degree, deepening degree of political representation is that economic governance really suffers. And economic governance suffers because the political system is at all times trying to represent competing vested interests. So I can give you many examples of that, but since I'm talking about the financial system, what has this meant for the financial system, right? What this has meant is that nationalization, actually, if you look at it through this lens, of our banking system was pretty much inevitable. It happened along that same logic. So nationalization, it led to the nationalization of the first wave of banks in 1969, the second wave in 1980, as a result of which in 1980, 91% of the assets of the financial system were in public sector banks. And since then till now, the share of private sector banks has only decreased from 91% to some 72, 73%. So there hasn't been all that much increased space that has been given to private banking in all these years, right? So that was the first implication. Second implication for the banking system is a very creative Indian construct, and has to do with the point I was making about rising expenditures. And so if you are the type of democracy we are, we can't stop ourselves from spending a lot on, social and equality. Redistribution is the proper word, right? Is the better word. We do it wastefully, that's another question, but we have to do it. That's the political compunction. And as a result of which, we are chronically fiscally challenged, right? And the reasons for the chronic fiscal situation, it's not unique to us. Every democracy is the same. I mean, the United States has got so many contingent liabilities from its pensions and all these things, healthcare sitting on its books. That's the big adjustment, right? That's the mega adjustment that the West has to go through. What is the cost of now the welfare states in Europe? That's the structural adjustment that everybody's talking about. So we are not unique in that respect. It's just that we've had to do this much earlier in our development as an economy, and that's just the reality. So fiscal pressure, what is the implication of that for the financial system now? I've talked about the political economy of the fiscal pressure. What does it mean for the financial system? We created this wonderful thing called the SRR or SLR. And what is the SLR? The SLR is basically a formulation for sequestering savings that are household savings primarily, because households are the only net savers in the country, right? They're financial savings actually, that are intermediated through the banking system to sequester them for use for funding the government budget. So you will recall, whenever this question of getting rid of the SLR comes in, it is actually linked with the RBI's confidence with respect to the manageability of our fiscal deficit on an ongoing basis. And if you only have so much savings, and you know that our political reality is such that we will have a fiscal deficit that has to be funded, then this is actually quite a clever way of making that happen. Now, it's another thing that it impacts the fundamental profitability of banks. It's a tax. It's a financial repression of a different kind. It is financial. It's a tax that banks have to pay. So that's one impact that the political economy has had on financial sector. Second impact is manifested. That's the second impact. First impact was nationalization. Second is SLR. Third impact on the financial system is PSL, priority sector lending. Right? So you turn to the RBI and say, "Sir, PSL ka kuch kijiye." No, this is government. So you tell government, please do something about this priority sector lending targets. They're crazy. That's RBI. But it is actually the political logic of the system. Nationalization was justified at the time because government wanted to gain greater control over credit allocation. So the allocation of credit, and again, India is not unique in this. So many countries do this. But it comes from the compulsion of the egalitarian compulsion from democratic politics. There's a nuance to this, and if you, I'm going to run out of time very quickly, but I can go on this. The nuance about this is that the representation, pressure to represent in our system meant that we had to give disproportionate attention to rural India. That's where the votes are. right? That reflects in the PSL. So one of the stated goals of PSL was, no, there must be so much of credit that has to be somehow allocated to agriculture. So now, what comes out of this is what I want to turn next. So this is the pressure coming from the legislative arm of the state, right? But now let's look at how these things are implemented. And that is the responsibility, if you like, of the executive. And there, my hypothesis or my view, my prejudice, is that actually much more responsible for our predicament and much more responsible for the dysfunction that we see in this country than the legislature is actually our bureaucracy, the executive. So, okay, we have nationalized banks, but I don't think that there are ways to manage a public sector entity, and there are ways not to manage it. I don't want to get into this debate because I don't frankly believe in it. So I actually believe that it is possible to manage a public sector entity well, although some people would disagree with that. They'd say that's an oxymoron. But I think that there is a way of doing it, and the fact that they are not managed well has a lot to do with the dysfunction of the bureaucracy. So, this whole complex system of how bank CMDs are appointed, not appointed, how bank professionals can be paid, not paid, has been linked to the preoccupations of the Ministry of Finance and its mandarins. So why is it the case that no bank CMD can be paid more than the Secretary of the Government of India? Why is it the case that every decision with respect to choice of senior manager has to be made somewhere in the Ministry of Finance? I mean, after all, there is greater autonomy that is given to public sector enterprises elsewhere, but somehow this hasn't happened. So, the design of the PSL scheme itself, right? Now, finally, we are talking about PSL certificates that may make it, tradable. So people who are good at doing PSL may be able to trade that with somebody who's not so good, and there's a market clearing price for that. But today, why does the regulator have to be so extremely prescriptive about how PSL is done, the bucket, sub-bucket, sub-sub-bucket? What's the meaning of that? I mean, so there could have been a much more creative, more intelligent way of trying to achieve the same political goal than what we have done, what the executive arm of government has done. So as a result of this, what you get is the sausage, and it's not an edible sausage in our case, it's a dog's breakfast, is what we get. And to give you a sense, this is the number that I just got before I started my remarks, that after, 60 years of nationalized banks, you know what the gap is between total household savings and financial savings? Because if one of the objectives of nationalization was to make finance more accessible to people, you should see the gap between household savings and financial savings come down. In fact, the gap between financial savings and household savings has gone up. So household savings now are something like 18%. Financial savings for the last 4-5 years have been stagnating at around 7%. So it means that 10% of GDP equivalent sits out of the banking system that was supposed to crowd in savings from people who are putting it elsewhere. 10% of savings in this country are not being intermediated through the formal banking system. And my broader point, which connects to the comments I made in O.P. Jindal and on a wider canvas, is that by default, notwithstanding all these interventions, etc., through the nationalized PSU banking system, by default, the average Indian household for financial services has to rely on the informal private sector. It's exactly the same pattern as you see in all other things that government is supposed to deliver, whether it's education, it's public health. Right? You have the Right to Education Act, you have the largest number of school teachers anywhere in the world, right? But the school teachers are paid double of what the private school teacher is paid, and their productivity is half. And they don't teach because they don't show up half the time. So what do people do? They turn to private schools. In healthcare, it's even worse. People turn to private healthcare because they don't have a choice. They have to go to quacks because there is no functioning public health system. So notwithstanding all the political logic and the pressure, blah, blah, for us to deliver equal access, services, social services, right? I think in large part because of the dysfunction of the last mile bureaucracy, the citizen gets completely shortchanged, and financial services is no exception, is the point I'm making. So now, because time is running short, so that's my first point. This was the interaction between the state and markets. So what is the big point here is that actually by default, we end up relying on markets, informal markets, that are totally unregulated. So most people are going to chit funds, and we keep complaining about Sahara doing this, that, and the other. But what choice do people have? Or I'm going to my money lender, right? So the 10% gap, by the way, between household savings and financial savings, right? In a national income identity, that saving is also investment. So 10% is private household investment in the country. As a residual, it's exactly equal to the 10% of savings, non-financial savings of the household sector, because they are intermediating amongst themselves. That's all informal. That's all private. So that's what it means for markets. That's what our political economy means for markets, very broadly speaking, for financial sector. Now I want to spend just 2-3 minutes on state and society. What do I mean by that? So what are the social origins, anthropological origins of our business community? I mean, it's an abiding irony that in India, I used to work in Africa and all these places for the World Bank, and we used to go around in this futile quest for creating private sector. And you go to Burundi and say, we'll create the private sector, right? And say, what we're going to do, we're going to have a few consultants, we'll do ease of doing business and so on, private sector will happen, right? Here, we have ethnic communities that have centuries of experience in business, right? What is their interaction with the state? That's where I'm coming from. So there are actually, the caricature of that is, if you ask yourself the question, how did big business, how was big business created in India? There are 3 routes to it, right? One is from what is called from bazaar to business. So these are traders who became more involved in manufacturing and other kinds of industrial businesses, and over time became really big. These are the Marwadis, for example. They are the most important community, but Banyas generally. The Chettiars are like that. That's one community. But they were traders. So all the timber trade, for example, teak trade in Burma was done by the Chettiar community. And they made their wealth there. And then they became serious businessmen over time, parlaying on that wealth. The second road to big business is from farm to business. And that has happened particularly in southern India, in Andhra Pradesh, for example, and in Karnataka to some extent, where there were a lot of large farmers who, because of the canal building by the British, became contractors and made a lot of money. Then from contractors, they became serious businessmen. And that's happened over the last 30, 40. So the Reddys, the Kamas, these communities have become big business, starting from farm. Then there is a third route, which is office to business. So there are the Brahmins, and they are the Khatris. So the Brahmins and the Khatris were forced into business because they had no choice. The Khatris were mostly dislocated because of partition. And so they came to India and they had to do something creative, and they got into business and they became very successful. The Brahmins, likewise, in the south, in particular, because of the social revolution came much earlier in southern India, they got displaced in the social pecking order. They had no choice. So they went into bureaucracy, and some of them went into business, right? But having gotten into business, all three categories, they became big business actually in complicity with the state. So the big Marwadi houses became big. Some of this may be politically incorrect, so but I think it's interesting. We need to talk about these things. Became big because of the license Raj. And they thrived through the license Raj. They were very close to government. They were involved in the independence movement. They were close to the Congress party, and that's how they made their wealth. So that was their road to, and their complicity with the state. Second one was with the Kamas and the Reddys. That happened later. So when you look at the Telugu Desam party, for example, who are these people? These people were contractors who became big business people, developed very close links with the Congress party. Another example of this is the cooperative movement. This is how it links to the financial services, and I'll come to that in a minute. The cooperative movement, the sugar barons, right? They did the same thing. They started in farming, parlayed all of that in complicity with government. They raped all the cooperatives, right? Took loans from the government, never paid back, made a lot of wealth out of that, and have become big business people. So a lot of our, now this also has a reflection in the banking system. So you know where our banks came from in this country, modern banks. There were three types of banks that were created in India, starting the late 19th century, but really early 20th century. One was each of the princely states, they had their bank. So the Gaikwads had their bank. Bank of Baroda, that's the Bank of Baroda, is the Gaikwad family. And so on and so forth. There are many other, Bank of Travancore was the Maharaja of Travancore, and so on and so forth. All these people have, the princely states had their banks. Second was the agencies. These are the British agencies that converted themselves, and that became the Imperial Bank, which became the State Bank of India. And then the third source were communities. So Udupi, for example, is extraordinary. I mean, they created banks. I think half a dozen banks were created in Udupi to serve specific communities. And actually, the community banks are the only ones that were not nationalized. And they remain. Only there were some that weren't doing so well. They were consolidated, but the others were not deliberately nationalized. They still survive. So Federal Bank, Lakshmi Vilas Bank, Karnataka Bank, all these banks are community banks, actually. And so now you think about the social origins of financial services. You have a history of business communities who have taken advantage of the relationship with state to build wealth for themselves. And that, I think, politically was unacceptable, led to nationalization, but since then, in the psyche of the regulator, has created an enormous fear about letting the private into banking. Because they've seen this complicity in the past. Evidence is all around us. And therefore, there is a huge resistance to allowing the traditional private communities that have done very well in business to also gain a foothold into banking. On top of this, you layer on politically motivated institutions that were created. The entire RRB infrastructure, the cooperative banks was part of the whole PSL, type of mindset, which has been captured in many regards and has since become dysfunctional. So that's really the few observations I wanted to make about the relationship between society and market. So at least until the 1990s, the story has been one of very entrepreneurial communities that have gained from complicity with the state. Now we come fast forward to the 1990s, and something very important started accelerating in the 1990s. The social networks that were necessary for the success of the traditional business became less important. So the hundi became less important. It wasn't just a trust based contract between two business people of the same community. The corporate community began to transfer its needs for intermediation to a formal banking system. So if you look at the composition of lending from the banks today, 35-40% of all lending is large corporate. Agriculture is only 13%. So what we have seen in the last few years is that business dependence on social networks to fund themselves has abated, and they have replaced that with a dependence on a formal banking system. Now, if I were to put all these strands together, my concluding observation would be this, that because of the historical antecedents and the anthropological antecedents of our business community, and the type of financial institutions that developed, right? We have now created a financial system that, despite the best intentions of our democracy, fails to deliver on its intended objective. Which is why, we spend so much time talking about financial inclusion. Right? It fails to deliver on that intent. And this is actually becoming a very serious problem. It's not just a question of politics. It's a question of fundamental reform for sustainable growth. If we want sustainable growth in this country, financial inclusion is not necessary just for the point of view of making people feel good. It's a morally right thing to do. My view is that it is essential to deliver sustainable growth in this country. Why do I say that? Because big business is not able to create jobs. It is not a job creating engine. Anywhere in the world, you look at even China, right? The big growth in employment that came after the reform started in the 1970s came from the township and village enterprises. That was small companies, SMEs, doing exports and little industrial activity and so on. Anywhere in the West, you see, if you look at Germany, The bulk of the jobs are created in the Mittelstand by the small and medium-sized German engineering and other enterprises. It's not the large corporates that are creating them. The large multinationals, I hate to use that term, but the large corporates in the United States are not creating jobs. Most of the jobs are created by small business, right? And small business, the self-employed, are precisely the people that are systematically excluded from our banking system today. Continue to be excluded from a banking system. They are the people who are intermediating, that's a 10% within households that is serving their own needs. Unless they are brought into the formal banking system and gain access to reasonable credit, right, you will not be able to fire up a sustainable job creating engine in this country. And therefore, I will conclude with, with just the observation that, which is an optimistic one, which is I believe that for us to, so if you accept the argument and you accept the hypothesis, the thesis that it is critically important for us to expand the financial space, the size of the banking system to include now small business, right? By improving the intermediation between households that are excluded from the financial system and small business. It can only be done if there is an alignment given our system between politics and the executive. So the legislature and the executive at least have to be completely aligned on this. I believe that there is a way to build that alignment. And I think that it would be politically very powerful over the next decade for a political party to champion the cause of small business. And if that could be made into a politically remunerative, rewarding strategy, then I think you will begin to see more change in policy, more change in direction that would take us along closer to the right road. Where I'm somewhat skeptical is really the pace of change of the executive and the last mile bureaucracy. So what does it take to change behaviors in the executive arm of government to make this a reality? And I'm coming to the conclusion that large-scale fundamental administrative reform is really the biggest unfinished agenda of reform in this country. And we can talk about GST, we can talk about this and that, payments, banks, this, that, and the other. All these are important, but fundamentally, unless we reposition, reorient, recraft the way in which the last mile of our state is functioning, we will not succeed. Thank you.
So we have 20 minutes before we have to start the next session.
Oh, good.
Can I give, yes, thank you, Rajiv. Can we have, we can take 5 minutes of questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
See, you said so many things and it was so interesting.
I'll be collecting the questions.
Hello?
Yeah, it's working.
It's working.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, my question to you is, see, there are so many issues. Like, I think the bureaucracy also has a role, probably, in telling, it should have the ability to tell a big corporate, don't keep 100,000 crores in cash and jolly well invest it. and preferably invest it in something where it should be treated as risk capital, where you really do it in something new. Now, one thing, since you've traveled abroad, I just wanted to know. See, it has been said that in Japan, probably also in Korea, and maybe even in China, the moral authority of the bureaucracy over the business sector has somehow been preserved. Because if you look at the Liberal Democratic Party in Japan, it is probably worse than even what we see in India over the last 50, 60 years, but has continued to rule. And what I understand is somehow the moral authority of the bureaucracy in Japan was never eroded. Can you just say something about that?
Yeah, so, because of the paucity of time, I have to apologize. I may not have positioned my message exactly in its complexity and nuance as I would have liked to, but maybe it'll come out in the question and answers. I didn't mean to suggest for a second that we should therefore, before I answer your question, that we should be anti-big business. See, just like politicians will be politicians, business will be business. I think to try and change business and enforce rules that, that are unrealistic is not going to serve any purpose. I think we should encourage, big business has its own place. After all, it may not create jobs directly, but it can create jobs indirectly. It can invest a lot. It can become embedded in a global supply chain, and therefore create all kinds of ancillary jobs in the country. I just wanted to clarify that. When it comes to bureaucracy, and actually, so of the three, when you take business, politicians, and bureaucracy, I am more accepting of the failings, if you like, or the fallibility of business and politicians, but it's the bureaucracy I'm having the biggest problem with. And actually, our bureaucracy is very different from the Chinese or the Japanese bureaucracy, anywhere in East Asia, where they have retained a certain authority, you're right. In China, it's indisputable. I mean, there the lines are drawn between what is bureaucracy and what is business. That's why it's state capitalism, right? But their objectives and motivations seem to be very different from our bureaucracy. One of the explanations for, I think, the dysfunction vis-a-vis the market of our bureaucracy, I believe, has to do, again, with the anthropological origins of it. And the historical origins of it. So the anthropological origins, if you look at, for example, the caste composition of bureaucracy. Caste composition of bureaucracy is overwhelmingly upper caste. And because of affirmative action, now you have Dalits and minority communities that have become part of bureaucracy. There are very few, OBCs that actually want to go into government. You can't force them to go into government, right? But the mindset of the people who are in bureaucracy, I mean, I grew up in a bureaucrat's family, so I can be very frank about it, is that ये business वाले तो सब चोर हैं. They're all thieves. If you look at if you go back to since independence, please look at the names of people who have become CBI directors in this country. They're either Brahmins or Thakurs. And for them, they look down on business. It's okay to be the policeman. It's okay to be the obstacle creator and maybe even extract rent from them. Because I'm the Mai Baap Sarkar. But I don't understand how to empathize with you as a business person. I don't understand how to nurture you. And I don't understand what it means to regulate constructively. That's a big cultural problem. And I may have told you, some of you, this in private, but I was at this meeting with the Prime Minister some months ago. And there were, a few economists he had called. and we were talking about the ease of doing business. And I, in a lighter vein, suggested to him that, if you want to change, have a real impact on the ease of doing business, for the next 15, 20 years, every IAS person you recruit must either be a Goyal, Agarwal, or a Gupta. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the very nice speech. Quick question is that, are we trying to, what is the impact on our community culture in our attempt to perhaps mimic Western economic growth model?
Sorry, can I intervene on that statement? That is like a really open topic, and if there are
Thank you.
more specific questions, so just to prioritize.
Yes.
More specific questions to the political economy of the financial sector reforms process. Sorry, Srini, I'm intervening very rudely here, but this is my style apparently. I'd like to then
Apparently.
request. Hang on. I've got two more questions that I can take from the floor because this next session starts at 1:30. Pradeep was next in line, and because I'm going to be gender biased here, I'm going to ask Jeenu to take the last question.
Okay.
So my more like comments. Sorry. You addressed a very wide swath of issues in a very broad canvas. So, but I'm just going to pick two or three to just make some comments. The first one, you've raised the issue about the fact the problems are all at the door of the bureaucrats rather than at the
I'm
politicians.
exaggerating, yeah.
Of course, exaggerating. So, now, I mean, having served in the civil service, I have seen the most outstanding bureaucrats, and I've seen the most outstanding politicians, and I've seen the absolute crap in politics and the absolute crap in bureaucracy. So, to make a statement one way or the other, I think one is looking at either the trunk of the elephant or the backside of the elephant, and it depends on which one you've had a better sight of, probably conditions the beliefs in that regard. So I really would not, make broad comments on that. Number one. Number two.
Let me get this clear. Are you defending the
Yes.
I'm not. I'm making
No, but
I'm making a very.
it's an important point. It's an
I'm
important
making a
point. I
very
want to
neutral.
respond to
I'm
that.
making a very neutral
Yes,
statement.
you're
So
right.
I'm not
You're right.
really defending one or the
Yeah.
other.
Yeah.
Number two, you set off with the fact that we have evolved to this point politically because that's the only way we could have evolved. And if we take the first 20 years of independence, up to 1970, we had the Nehru model, and yes, there was growth with social justice, and social justice was an element of the plank, but a very important aspect of the plank was growth. Economic growth was an extremely important policy priority. Now, in 1970, for what I would consider as overtly political reasons, that was changed. And I have once again nothing against Mrs. Gandhi or anybody else.
That was the Garibi Hatao campaign.
That was the aspect where we changed the constitution,
Yep.
added the word socialist
Yep.
to the constitution,
Yep.
and once again, as you said, it's a hypothesis, a belief, or a bias. You used to quote your words. I would say that Mrs. Gandhi's whatever is political experience or whatever, that social excessive importance of one aspect upset the balance, which was redressed only when Manmohan Singh and Narasimha Rao came back in the mid-90s with the economic liberalization program. And I think it set the country back 20 years. So the third thing which I want to say is that the politics of this country is very heavily oriented towards individuals. It's not oriented towards ideology. So yes, you have idiosyncrasies like, the Republicans having a problem with abortion and all that nonsense. By and large, Democrats and Republicans are to the left or the right of the economic spectrum. Political ideology is based on economics. If you look at labor or conservative, political ideology is based in the United Kingdom on economics. In India, the way the system has evolved, the political economy has, politics has not been based
much
at
more on
all,
identity, right?
at all on economics. To a large extent, that could well be the result of the way in which the political class, and once again, I'm not reflecting a bias one way or the other, the way the political class was evolved and the barriers to entry for people to enter politics have been extremely high. So because of whatever reason, everything is based on personalities and nothing is based on economic ideology. I think in some sense, the fact that we have a prime ministerial system and a system where everything is based on elected representatives, rather than this distinction between the legislature and executive, has contributed to that. If we were to move to a system which was much more executive separate and legislative separate, I think
Could be a different story.
it would be a different story. Because, and in some sense, not only the American system, but also the Chinese system is the same. The Chinese system evolves the best administrator out of the, as the person who becomes the political master. Now here, that's not the case. And that's because you are courting a set of legislators or politicians rather than quoting the public at large. And meet the public at large only once in 5 years.
Okay.
So
I'll
they are comments, not questions.
I just wanted to address one of them very quickly, which is your first point about your bureaucracy. So I may have, it was really meant to be in a lighter vein, singled out the IAS as a problem. Actually, I think so when I meant the problem of the bureaucracy is really not so much the IAS. The problem of the bureaucracy is the various other people, the hordes of people that we've hired in government. So government is no longer for the people, it's for government employees. So if you look at the pay commission, for example, we only have 4,500 IAS officers in this country. We have, I don't know how many foreign service officers, but very, very few. A country of 1.2 billion, 640 districts and all of that, you should have treble, quadruple the number of IAS officers or qualified, well-trained senior officers. You must really slash the last mile individual who is, all that he or she is doing is now rent seeking at the last mile. That's the big change that we need. So in the pay commission, the fact that class 4 employees in government are earning 3 times what their private sector compatriots are earning is ridiculous. Rather double the salary of the top guys, hire more of them, and slash the bureaucracy in half. That's what I meant. So the bureaucracy has become self-serving. Even if you ask, we've been conducting some surveys, you ask people now, what is your top choice of job, especially in North India? The answer is government. किसी तरह कहीं लगा दो नौकरी, but चपरासी बना दो. Railways is the same problem. So we can have this is a long conversation, but yeah, so last question.
Last question. So it's going to be very short, and it's not going to be, it lives up to Susan's standards. You ended your points on the financial sector reform that's stalling now.
Yeah.
But most of your points were on banking sector reform. Yeah. And the political economy of banking sector reform makes sense because the average voter sort of sees the banking sector. What's the political economy of the non-bank financial sector reform? Because the average voter probably doesn't care about which institution manages public debt or which institution resolves a non-financial or financial sector institution. But yet there is a political economy that I don't quite understand.
No, so I wasn't clear enough in my exposition. What I was trying to say is that because of the way in which our banks have evolved for our political economy, the consequence of that is actually the informal financial system, the non-bank financial system, has every logic to be very large. Right? And then you create a regulatory battle. Regulator doesn't like that. And it keeps coming down and suppressing the non-bank financial system. But that goes against the grain of, how the whole weight of the system is pushing everybody, the direction in which we're being pushed. So the regulator, is now worried about non-bank finance companies. We've had one wave in the 1990s. We came down very hard on them, and all they keep doing is trying to remove the regulatory arbitrage between the non-bank finance company and the bank, make India a bank-centric economy, when the political economy's logic is just the opposite. And I don't know how you resolve that unless you address the political economy.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Rajiv. One round of applause, please. Thank you.